Because they are anointed or appointed for a specific duty, for a specific ministry, specific service, for a specific period of time. But there is the Messiah, which is mentioned in the book of Isaiah and other prophetic books, that is supposed to be the ultimate anointed one, that would do things that no other human being before him could do. For example, raise the dead. What else?
Now hang on, Elijah and Elisha raised the dead.
Well, I can go there, but I don't want to. There might be the clinical form of death.
So did Paul.
Huh?
So did Peter and so did Paul.
Yeah. Well, I won't go into that discussion. What else did Jesus do? Heal the sick. Did anybody else heal the sick? Yeah. Okay. What else?
Forgave sin.
Huh?
Forgave sin.
Forgave sin. Interesting. What does the statement mean? Is it easier to say, get up and walk, or I forgive you your sins? Remember? What is easier to say?
I forgive you the sins.
I forgive you the sins because you can't see the action or you can't see the result of that, right? But he said, get up and walk and get your belongings and go. So it was double salvation. It was salvation from his physical sickness and also from his spiritual sickness or spiritual death, we could say. But there are many other things that only Jesus could do and no other person or prophet could do, which basically was classifying him as the Messiah. But Pharisees would not believe that because they couldn't or they wouldn't. What do you think? Okay.
I did have one more question about the judges. It actually used the word Mashiach in Judges.
Mm-hmm.
What was that the actual word that meant judge?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, the judge, Shofet was a judge. Yeah. But there is also Mashiach Shofet. It's interchangeable terminologies, and it was quite widely used. So there are many messiahs, but this one is the Messiah. Okay. What else Matthew does? Matthew documents Jesus Christ's claim to be a Messiah. His genealogy, baptism, messages, and miracles all point to the same inescapable conclusion: Christ is the King. It's interesting that teaching of Jesus is built up in Matthew in such a way that it climaxes with his crucifixion, resurrection stories. We'll be discussing in a little while how the book is planned and how it's divided in different sections, and you will see how Matthew basically forms his presentation of Jesus' life. So it becomes logical for a Jewish person to come to certain conclusions by the end of the book. The author of the Gospel, Matthew. What is the meaning of the name Matthew? Does anybody know? I don't know. I'm just asking. He's the son of Alphaeus, that we know from Mark 2:14. He occupied the unpopular post of tax collector or the Internal Revenue Service agent in Capernaum for the Roman government. First of all, he was a tax collector. That was a bad thing in itself. Secondly, he was a tax collector for the enemy, which is the Roman government. And the Roman government was an occupying force. It's the same thing as somebody would be a tax collector for Nazi Germany on, let's say, French territories. You know, it's basically collecting money for Nazis who are partying, in bars and whatever, killing your people, raping your women, and so on and so forth, destroying your country, your culture. So these people were doubly condemned by their own nation. They were the lowest class possible, the most shameful people of all in the nation. Everybody would spit in the direction of a tax collector right after they paid tax. You know, probably there was a spittoon by the side of the tax collectors. That's just my imagination working. As a publican, not Republican, publican, he was no doubt disliked by his Jewish countrymen. He was chosen as one of the 12 apostles, and the last appearance of his name is in Acts 1:13. Interesting that Jesus selects or chooses Matthew to be one of his disciples. And in fact, Matthew is such a person that is shocked by that decision, because according to public opinion, he is supposed to be the shameful one. Nobody's supposed to talk to him or even view him as a person. And here, one of the popular rabbis becomes his advisor, teacher, mentor, and he selects Matthew. In fact, he visits his home and eats with Matthew, which is even worse than associating with somebody. In the Jewish culture, if you sit down at the same table and eat with somebody, you're basically associating yourself with that individual. You're agreeing with who they are, what they do, what they preach, and what they stand for. That is why Pharisees and Sadducees were accusing Jesus of eating with prostitutes and poor people and lowlifes, because they were saying that publicly your message is, I approve of these people and of what they do. And that was very unacceptable for power-hungry Pharisees and Sadducees, because in their eyes, all of these people were scum, and they would just walk by them, would never turn their heads towards them. Remember the story about the Good Samaritan? Priest and then a Levite, they passed by that individual. They didn't even touch them because of the cleanliness laws and because they were going to service and all that stuff. That's how the Pharisees would act if you would get hurt or get in the accident. They would just pass by. Oh, I see some blood. They wouldn't even call 911.
And it's interesting how today we're totally opposite when it comes to selecting a lay person.
Yep, that is true.
Interesting.
That is how impactful the gospel and the Judeo-Christian morals are in society surrounding us. That's how much impact they have shown through the years. It's not just happened. You know? And we think it's a norm, when in those days it was abnormal. All right. Date and setting of Matthew. The likely time frame for this book is about 58 to 68 AD. We don't know, to be exact, when it was written. We know that it's a very strongly Jewish book, and it explains a lot of Jewish elements of culture, and most likely written before the destruction of the temple. The temple was destructed in what year? 70 AD. That means, since Matthew does not mention that destruction of the temple and dispersion of the Jews from Jerusalem, this book was written prior to those events. Because I would strongly doubt that he would skip writing about these important events. In fact, that might be a fulfillment of some prophecies from the Old Testament. Secondly, we know that it's written later in time after the writings of Paul. And Paul died probably around 64, 65 AD. So a lot of teachings of Jesus that are echoed with Paul would be probably mentioned if Paul died before this book was written. Yes.
Something I've never been able to quite understand is, if you were like following Jesus around, hanging out with him for 3.5 years, would you have taken notes?
It's a very good question.
And especially if you're a tax collector.
Very
because
good question.
There's a guy that keeps records, right?
Yeah. In fact, those of us who study scriptures a little bit deeper and spend 50 years of our lives creating a dictionary of theology, we come to conclusions that there is a writing which is called sometimes Q, or the Gospel of Thomas. It is the collection of Jesus' sayings, statements, and his miracles, which is in unedited form, kind of just a list of events. These ideas or statements were used by both Mark and Matthew to combine them into a logical body of literature called the Gospel. We know Matthew and Mark did not go through a thorough research of the whole birth of Jesus, events surrounding them, and all that Luke went through, because Luke didn't have any first sources. He had to go and actually research all of that. Mark and Matthew used that Q, or Gospel of Thomas, which is actually notes scribbled by someone. We call him Thomas. We don't know if it's Thomas, one of the disciples, or not. But most likely they also took notes or jotted down something, if they knew how to write. See, you have to keep in mind that most of the apostles did not know how to write. They were fishermen. Matthew, as a tax collector, probably could write, and in fact, we don't see in the Gospel of Matthew mentioning of a scribe that is actually writing his manuscript. But maybe at that time he wasn't thinking along those lines, because, you know, if I know Adam, right, we talk, we fellowship together and so on, but then Adam becomes a president, right? And I'm thinking, man, I knew this guy when I was in seminary. So now I'm writing in my memoirs that I used to know Adam when he was still a student in the 10th year of his program, you know. So you see, when something else happens later on, that's when you kind of shocked about all the neglect of time in the past, and you start thinking, well, I better put it in writing, because otherwise that's a valuable material. See, the same thing about apostles. They didn't know that Jesus was going to die. They were thinking he's going to be with them forever. In fact, they were hoping that he's going to restore Israel's kingdom right there and then, because that was his primary purpose of coming to earth. And in fact, when Jesus dies and is taken away to heaven, they're waiting in the matter of weeks for him to come back, right? Because they sold everything they owned. All of the Land Rovers, Toyota, Explorer, Hammers, and all of the vehicles gone. I mean, everything sold. Houses, you know, California, $1.5 million houses sold. Properties donated to the church. And then they wake up from a dream or a nightmare. They discover that they're poor, they don't work, and Jesus is not coming back. And they think, well, we do live in the last age, or last times, and so it was for 2,000 years. So that's probably why they didn't put it in writing while they were walking with Jesus. And maybe there wasn't time, you know, or enough lighting. Because the first laptops, came in like 3rd century, yeah, I'm talking about the ones that you use the stylus on, you know, first PDA stylus. Real stylus, not the... The gospel may have been written in Palestine or Syrian Antioch. Could be written in Palestine, where the Israel is located, or in Syrian Antioch, which is where? Slightly north of Israel, where the first largest Gentile church was formed by Paul, actually not even by Paul, by somebody else. Paul just kind of visited that church later on. He was introduced to the brothers over there, and Gentiles were growing tremendously while the Jerusalem church was declining, actually, in numbers. So it's possible that Matthew relocated to Syrian Antioch. We don't know again, that's just a speculation. It's either or. Okay, the theme of Matthew's gospel. The Gospel of Matthew is clearly written